Something happened at Arlington National Cemetery that left an entire crowd speechless. A single moment, unexpected and unforgettable, turned what began as an ordinary visit into a lesson no one present would ever forget. Some whispered in shock, others stood frozen in silence, and at the center of it all, a guard, unshakable, refusing to back down. What could make trained soldiers break their silence? What could leave tourists too stunned to even lift their cameras? Today, we'll walk you step by step through the event that changed the atmosphere in an instant and explain why this place demands more respect than most people realize. But before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe stories of honor like this deserve to be told, tap the like button so more people can hear them. The air at Arlington feels different. Even before you see the white rows of headstones stretching endlessly into the distance, you feel the weight of history pressing down. People walk slower here, voices lower themselves without being asked. It's not just a cemetery. It's sacred ground, where silence speaks louder than words. At the very heart of this place lies the tomb of the unknown soldier. An unbroken watch has been kept here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, through rain, snow and scorching heat. The guards who march before it are not ordinary soldiers. They are chosen from the few who can master a discipline so exact, so demanding, that a single misplaced step could mean dismissal. 21 steps forward, 21 seconds paused, 21 steps back. It is a rhythm as steady as time itself, a living symbol of respect for every soldier who never made it home. On this day, the crowd had gathered as it always does. Veterans, families, school children, travelers from around the world. Some watched in awe, others stood quietly. Cameras ready. Most understood, at least in part, that this was not a performance, but a ritual of honor. Yet hidden among the reverent, there was one who did not see it that way. A tourist whose smile carried more arrogance than respect. Someone who would soon test the very patience of the guard who stood watch, and the limits of the silence that surrounded the tomb. The morning sun had cast long shadows across the marble. Visitors trickled in from different corners of the cemetery, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone paths. Families held hands. School groups clustered near their teachers, and veterans walked with measured steps, their eyes fixed forward. No one needed to be told to lower their voices. The presence of the place demanded it. There's a rhythm to the way people gather at the tomb. First, the quiet shuffle of shoes. Then the clicks of cameras, hushed as quickly as they rise. And finally, the stillness, as all eyes settle on the guard. It isn't entertainment, it's reverence. For most, the weight of the ceremony is clear from the very first glance. But every crowd is different. And within this one, something felt slightly off. A ripple of unease. Somewhere near the back, laughter broke the pattern. Not the kind of laughter that comes from nervous respect, but the careless sort, sharp and jarring in a place built on silence. A few heads turned, parents frowned, teachers pressed a finger to their lips, shushing their students as if the sound had come from them. But it hadn't. It came from a man who seemed oblivious to the mood around him. A tourist, camera slung carelessly around his neck, his grin a little too wide. He leaned against the railing, pointing toward the guard with a mocking chuckle, whispering to his companion as if the ceremony were some curious spectacle meant for amusement. Most visitors melted into the silence. He stood out without even raising his voice. Still, the guard did not flinch. He marched as steady as ever, 21 steps in one direction, a pause, then 21 steps back. His face betrayed nothing. His eyes never shifted. For him, it was just another moment in an endless watch. But among the crowd, a tension had begun to build. People exchanged looks. Veterans clenched their jaws. Even the children sensed something was wrong. One man's arrogance was about to collide with a duty stronger than anything he could imagine. At first it was subtle. The tourist leaned forward, whispering to his companion, imitating the guard's stiff, deliberate movements with exaggerated gestures. A smirk pulled at his face as if the sacred precision before him were some sort of performance to mock. A few people in the crowd noticed, exchanging uneasy glances, but said nothing. Confrontation didn't belong here. Silence did. Yet silence was being chipped away piece by piece. The guard remained unshaken. His steps landed in perfect cadence against the marble, each one echoing like a heartbeat through the crowd. He had been trained for distractions, cameras, noises, even weather that could break a lesser soldier's focus. But disrespect, deliberate, mocking disrespect, carried a different weight. Still, his eyes never wavered. His watch continued. The tourist, however, seemed emboldened by the lack of response. His whispers grew louder. At one point he mimed holding an invisible rifle, stumbling clumsily as if to parody the guard's controlled movements. A couple of teenagers in the crowd giggled nervously, but the sound died quickly under the sharp glares of nearby veterans. The laughter wasn't spreading, it was isolating him. Even so, the tension spread. Parents held their children closer, as though shielding them from the arrogance unfolding just feet away. One elderly veteran, his hat marked with the emblem of his service, shook his head in visible disgust. His lips pressed together, but his silence spoke volumes. Here, at a place where honor was non-negotiable, one man was turning solemnity into spectacle. Every second that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last. The guard continued his precise 21 steps, but the eyes of the crowd had shifted. No longer fixed only on the ritual, they flickered between the soldier and the man who dared to mock him. An unspoken question hung in the air. How far would this go? And when would the guard respond? And then it happened. The guard stopped mid-stride, boots striking the marble with a final echo that cut through the air like a crack of thunder. The sound alone froze the crowd. The sudden end of a rhythm that had seemed eternal. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence was heavier than ever before, pressing down on everyone present. Then, in a voice that rang with unshakable authority, the guard spoke. "It is requested that everyone maintain an atmosphere of silence and respect." The words didn't rise in anger. They didn't need to. They carried the weight of tradition, discipline, and the countless soldiers represented by the tomb. The sound reverberated through the space, not loud, but powerful enough to send chills through the crowd. It was the kind of command that could silence even the strongest voice. And it did. Every head turned. Parents instinctively hushed their children. Veterans stood a little taller, eyes locked on the soldier whose watch had finally broken its silence. For a moment the crowd was unified. Not against the guard, but against the man whose disrespect had forced such words to be spoken. The tourist's smirk faltered. His companion shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the weight of dozens of eyes staring their way. Yet still, something in his expression lingered, a trace of arrogance, as though he hadn't fully understood the depth of the line he'd crossed. But make no mistake, the atmosphere had changed. The guard had spoken, and in doing so, reminded every person present that this was not a stage, not a show, not a tourist attraction. It was sacred ground, and the words, though delivered in calm authority, carried a warning that everyone understood. One step further, and there would be consequences. For most people, that single command would have been enough, but not for him. His pride, perhaps bruised by being called out in front of so many, refused to let him step back. And while the guard returned to his march, resuming the cadence as though nothing had changed, the eyes of the crowd told a different story. They waited. They watched. They knew this moment wasn't finished yet. The guard's warning should have ended it. For a few long moments, it seemed it had. The crowd settled back into silence, the air once again heavy with respect. The guard's boots struck the marble in perfect rhythm, his eyes unyielding, his posture flawless. Order had been restored. Or so it seemed. But arrogance has a way of ignoring warnings. As the guard turned to retrace his steps, the tourist shifted. He leaned further over the railing, his grin creeping back as though the reprimand had only fueled his defiance. A camera phone rose in his hand, angled carelessly toward the soldier. Not to honor the moment, not to capture the reverence, but to mock, to record himself where respect was demanded most. The sound of a laugh, sharp, out of place, broke across the crowd. This time it was louder, deliberate. People gasped. A veteran muttered under his breath, fists tightening at his side. Parents shook their heads, pulling their children closer, shielding them from the sight of a man who had decided this sacred ground was his stage. And then he did it. He crossed the invisible line. A foot lifted, stepping beyond the boundary where visitors were meant to stand. It was a small movement, a single step forward, but here in this place it carried the weight of something far greater. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The line between observer and intruder had been broken. The guard stopped instantly. His boots slammed into the marble, the sound reverberating through the silence like thunder. In one swift, disciplined motion, his rifle shifted from his shoulder into position across his chest. A gesture so sharp, so precise, it commanded attention without a single word spoken. The tourist froze. The smirk that had lingered so stubbornly drained from his face. For the first time, he seemed to realize the seriousness of what he had done. This wasn't a game, this wasn't a performance. This was a soldier, trained to defend the sanctity of the tomb, now standing ready. The guard's voice broke the air again, louder this time, carried with the full force of military command. It is requested that everyone remain behind the barrier and maintain an atmosphere of silence and respect. The words were simple, but the tone, sharp, commanding, unshakable, left no room for misinterpretation. This was not a suggestion. It was an order. An order backed not by anger, but by centuries of tradition and the discipline of soldiers who had given everything. The crowd erupted in whispers. Phones were lowered, cameras forgotten. Every eye locked on the guard, then shifted to the man who had dared to mock him. The tourist's bravado crumbled. He shuffled backward, retreating behind the railing as if the weight of every stair in that cemetery bore down on him at once. And in that instant, silence returned, not the uneasy silence from before, but a heavier one. A silence that carried respect, awe, and relief. The guard had re-established order, the tomb remained protected, and the lesson, unspoken but clear, had been delivered. The moment the tourists stepped back behind the barrier, it was as if the air itself shifted. The tension that had hung heavy over the crowd slowly unravelled, replaced with a silence that carried new meaning. No one spoke. No one dared. The guard, rifle still firm across his chest, held his position for a few seconds longer. His eyes fixed straight ahead, his jaw unyielding, his body a wall of discipline. It wasn't anger that radiated from him, it was duty. An unwavering reminder that he wasn't there for the crowd, and certainly not for the tourist. He was there for the tomb. Then, with a motion as precise as the first, the guard returned his rifle to position. His boots struck the marble once more, resuming the cadence. 21 steps forward, pause, 21 steps back. To the untrained eye, it might have looked as though nothing had happened. But for everyone watching, the moment had left a mark they would never forget. The crowd's reaction was subtle at first. A nervous cough, the shuffle of shoes. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. A few parents whispered to their children, explaining why silence mattered here more than anywhere else. Veterans nodded in quiet approval, their eyes reflecting both respect for the guard and frustration at the tourists' arrogance. Some simply stood frozen, replaying what they had just witnessed, unsure if they had truly grasped the weight of it. For many, it was the first time they had seen the guard break silence. Most visitors leave with the memory of a perfectly executed ritual, flawless in its discipline. But now this crowd had witnessed something few ever do. The moment when discipline and defense intersect. The moment when the guard, without hesitation, reminded everyone that this was not performance, but protection. The tourist, once smug and careless, was no longer the center of his own story. His retreat behind the barrier had stripped him of the attention he sought. Now he stood small among the sea of onlookers, his head bowed slightly, his arrogance swallowed by humiliation. His companion avoided eye contact with anyone, their earlier chuckles now replaced by a silence heavier than the guard's command. For the rest of the ceremony, no sound dared to rise above the striking of the guard's boots. Not a laugh, not a whisper, only reverence. The lesson had been delivered not with violence, not with punishment, but with discipline, precision, and the authority of tradition that allowed no exceptions. In that silence, every person present carried the same thought. This ground is not for mockery. It is for memory. Long after the guard's command faded into silence, its weight remained. The crowd had witnessed discipline in its purest form, but beneath the precision lay a truth that often goes unspoken. The tomb of the unknown soldier is not simply a monument. It is a promise. A promise that those who gave everything, even their names, will never be forgotten. The rules here are strict. No laughter, no interruptions, no distractions. Some outsiders might see them as harsh, unnecessary, or even excessive. But for those who understand, these rules are not about restricting behavior. They are about preserving honor. The silence is not empty. It is filled with respect for the countless soldiers whose stories will never be told, whose families never knew their final resting place. Each moment of quiet is a moment of remembrance. The guard embodies that remembrance. His 21 steps are not arbitrary. They echo the 21-gun salute, the highest military honor. His pause is not hesitation. It is reflection. His movements are not for spectacle. They are for the fallen. And when those rituals are interrupted, when disrespect creeps in, it is not just the guard who feels it. It is every one who has come to stand in the presence of sacrifice. The tourists' actions, though small in the grand scheme, exposed something important. Many arrive at the tomb without realizing the depth of what it represents. They see uniforms, rifles, and flawless marches, but they don't always feel the invisible weight of tradition. Yet all it takes is one act of arrogance, one moment of mockery, to reveal how fragile respect can be, and how vital it is that it be defended. What the guard demonstrated in that moment wasn't just discipline. It was the living expression of duty. His words were few, his tone calm, but behind them was the voice of every soldier who had ever stood watch. He reminded the world that this was not a place for individuals to take the spotlight. This was a place where the unknown, the forgotten, the silent heroes of war are given their rightful honor. And for those who witnessed it, the lesson lingered. The veterans felt vindicated, knowing the sacrifice of their brothers and sisters was not being trivialized. The families found reassurance that their children were learning the value of reverence. Even those who had come as casual tourists left with something more, a story they would carry with them, a reminder of what respect truly means. The tomb teaches in silence. But sometimes, as that tourist learned, the silence speaks loudest when it is broken. As the ceremony drew to its close, the guard continued his watch, unshaken, unbroken, unchanged. To him, this was not a moment of spectacle. It was just another day. Another chapter in an endless vigil that has stretched across generations. Yet for the crowd, the memory of what they had just witnessed would remain long after they left the cemetery grounds. In that brief encounter between arrogance and duty, something timeless had been revealed. The guard had not raised his voice in anger. He had not lashed out in pride. Instead, he had done what soldiers have always done, held the line. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that some lines are not meant to be crossed, not because they are guarded by rifles, but because they are guarded by meaning. The tomb of the unknown soldier is not just a slab of marble. It is a sacred promise. A promise that no matter how much time passes, the lives sacrificed in anonymity will never fade into silence. The guards, with their unyielding discipline, carry that promise in every step. They do not guard the tomb for recognition. They do not march for applause. They march because someone must stand watch. Someone must bear the burden of memory when others forget. And perhaps that is why this story resonates so deeply. It is not about a tourist's foolish mistake. It is about the guard's unwavering response. It is about the discipline that speaks louder than anger, the silence that carries more power than noise, and the reminder that respect, once lost, must always be reclaimed. The crowd that day left changed. Some carried the weight of embarrassment, others the pride of witnessing duty in action. Parents walked away with a story to tell their children about honor and reverence. Veterans left reassured that their sacrifices and those of their brothers and sisters still commanded respect. And even the tourist, though humiliated, carried away a lesson he may never forget, that arrogance has no place where silence stands guard. For you, listening now, perhaps the lesson is the same. In a world filled with distractions, noise, and spectacle, there are still places that demand something different from us, places where the greatest act we can perform is not to speak, but to listen, not to take, but to honor, not to mock, but to remember. So the next time you find yourself standing before a monument, a memorial, or even the quiet grave of a loved one, let this story echo in your mind. Let the memory of the guard's voice remind you that respect is not optional. It is the price we pay for the freedoms given to us by those who can no longer speak for themselves. At the tomb of the unknown soldier, silence is not emptiness. It is gratitude. It is memory. It is sacrifice made visible. And on that day, when one man chose arrogance, the guard chose duty. And in choosing duty, he reminded us all why some lines must never be crossed.